Well, hello everyone, and welcome to today's Idealist and CCVA joint webinar. My name is Faiza Venzant. I am the Executive Director for the Council for Certification in Volunteer Administration, and I am thrilled to be here with you today. We are talking about the role of ethics in volunteer administration, and today's webinar is called Am I Making the Right Decision? I want to say thank you to Idealist for including the topic of professional ethics, especially since it's not a subject that we talk about or focus on very often. It's my pleasure to share this information with you today on behalf of CCVA, which stands for the Council for Certification in Volunteer Administration. CCVA has been home to the professional ethics for many years. And if you're not familiar with CCVA, the Council sponsors the International Certified in Volunteer Administration CVA credential for our field. I'll be sharing all of today's slides after the session. And then in addition to the slides, there are two handouts related to the session that I'm going to be referring to, and they are available on our website. And actually, I'll send those over to Jennifer as well, and she'll include those two in today's session as well. So let's get started. I want to start by telling you a little bit more about CCVA. At CCVA, our vision is a world where competent, passionate leaders like you effectively engage volunteers. In the volunteer engagement space, we have a very focused mission. We do two things. We administer the CVA, Certified in Volunteer Administration credential, and we promote ethics in our profession. To date, over 3,000 people have obtained the CVA credential, and there are currently 1,200 CVAs worldwide. And I wanted to say thanks to everyone who is letting us know how hot or cold it is where they are joining us from. I thought it was funny that there was an individual in the chat named Sunshine talking about the colder temperatures. Here in Temecula, where I'm joining you from, it's a beautiful day. I won't complain. But wherever you're joining from, I'm happy to have you here. So let me tell you before we get started, we're going to be using Menti. And if you're not familiar with Menti, it's a really cool tool that you can use to be interactive and crowdsource information. So just for us to practice, I'm going to ask you to go to menti.com and use the code 48874901. And using emojis only if you can, let me know what is your favorite season. So continuing on the topic of the weather, and if you can't, get into Menti, feel free to let us know in the chat box as well. That's fine. Brianna, I'm going to put that for you in the chat as well. It is menti.com, and the code is 48874901. If you're also able to see the screen, you'll be able to see menti.com and then the code 48874901. Very great and colorful use of emojis here. I am seeing a definite early preference for fall from folks, fall and spring. I myself am a summer girl. I love the heat. I would rather be wearing fewer layers than having to peel them off. So I'm a summer girl as well. So great. And thank you to whoever popped that jack-o'-lantern in there. Super cute. So yes, we're going to be using Menti, and it looks like you all are familiar with how to do that, which is wonderful. So sort of continuing on from there, let me tell you a little bit about CCVA. To become certified or to become a CVA, or what we call Certified in Volunteer Administration, there's an application and there is a successful completion of an exam that consists of 100 multiple choice questions. All of the questions are based on the 7 competencies of leaders of volunteers that I have up on the screen, which are planning for strategic volunteer engagement, advocating for volunteer involvement, attracting and onboarding a workforce, preparing volunteers, documenting their involvement, managing performance and impact, and then acknowledging, celebrating, and sustaining volunteer involvement. I invite you to learn a little bit more about the CVA by joining us for an information session. You can join us for a free information session at cvacert.org/info. Both Jennifer and I have our CVA, and if you've got any questions, you could reach out to either one of us as well when it comes to learning about your CVA. So to get us started, there's three things that I'm hoping we take away from today. I hope that you're able to define the professional ethics for volunteer administrators and professionals after today. I hope that you have a better understanding of what I call craft, which is what we do, right? What we do in managing volunteers is unique. It takes a real specific set of skills, competencies, and experience. And there are 5 core values that make up our professional ethics, that make up the acronym CRAFT. So I'll go over that today and hope you're able to walk away with a better understanding of those values. And then lastly, I hope that you're able to walk away with a better understanding of the ethical decision-making process. And we're going to use a case study today to illustrate the ethical decision-making process and to talk about the core values as well. So to get us started, I want to share a bit of a case study with you. Erin is the community engagement manager at a food pantry. One of their board members has heard rumors that a volunteer had an encounter with law enforcement and had to appear in court. The board member asks Erin to confirm this information and says the volunteer must be dismissed if it's true. What do you think Erin should do? So here's an example of a volunteer professional within a food pantry. A board member has come to them about some rumors and has asked Erin to make sure that the volunteer is dismissed if the rumors are true. So using Menti with your gut reaction, just sort of what you feel in the moment, what do you think Erin should do? So hop on over to menti.com. The code is 48874901. And think about what you think Erin might do in this situation. So to recap, Erin is a community engagement manager. I love that first response. Mind your own business. Erin works in a food pantry, and a board member has come up to them and said, "Hey, I heard this volunteer had an encounter with the law and had to appear in court. I want you to find out more, and if this is true, the volunteer needs to be dismissed." So what do you think Erin should do? So we have some answers that are coming in through Menti. Gather as much information as possible, learn more from the volunteer before moving forward, run a background check. Another person saying get a background check. We've got some comments here around do some research, do some fact finding, have a conversation, not a punitive confrontation, but rather get some context. Someone said, seriously, why? Seek truth, further information, talk to Erin. What are the policies? Someone else says, advise the board member that dismissal is not necessarily the option. Speak with the volunteer. A lot of people talking about background checks, talking with the volunteer, needing more information. Someone else says, check with the organization's policy. There's a question here around, was this appearance due to a charge against them? Keep the volunteer's information confidential. Chat with the volunteer. This could just mean that they had a traffic ticket, right? So what you'll see is that when I pose the question to all of you around what should Erin do, there's a variety of answers, right? There are some answers that are real quick, like seriously, why would we do this, right? Or mind your own business, and real quick gut reactions. And then there are some that are really practical. There are some just different responses from different individuals. And this is exactly what we hope to see when it comes to thinking about an ethical dilemma. We're all going to have our own experience, lived experience, work experience, even experience with law enforcement that's going to inform the way we initially react to a situation, which all of you have done. So everyone is right in this situation. But there's obviously more steps to the process, and we are going to take a look at all of that as we go through today's content. All right, so before we go and revisit Erin, and we will come back and revisit Erin's dilemma, I want to give you a little bit of background and context for the topic. So ethics is something that has been talked about and written about for centuries. It's only been in about the last 55 years or so that we've connected it to the field of volunteerism. So, ethics is one of the defining characteristics of any profession, and the first statement of ethics in volunteer administration was developed in the 1970s as a way for practitioners at that time to signal to their colleagues and to their organizations that they took this work really seriously. And then later on, this early document was updated and revised by what was known as the AVA, Association for Volunteer Administration. And they did that revision based on the work of Michael Josephson, who is an international expert in the field of ethics. In 2006, AVA had to dissolve, and in order to preserve the previous work related to ethics in volunteer administration, the ownership was transferred to the newly formed CCVA, which is now, almost 20 years later, the Council for Certification in Volunteer Administration. We'll be celebrating our 20th anniversary next year. Um, CCVA updated the material again in 2016 to make sure that it was relevant and usable by practitioners and educators. This material is constantly updated by our ethics committee each year. And so the core values that I'll be talking with you about today are ones that we're constantly looking at. We're constantly meeting to discuss case studies and to talk about ethics. As the world changes, right? So, in 2020, we talked a lot about ethics in relation to the COVID-19 pandemic. Now we are starting to think about ethics in relation to AI and how we are starting to use that in our work as well. So we're constantly through that ethics committee revising and thinking about ethics as well. So thank you for being here today. We at CCVA, we strongly encourage you as volunteer engagement professionals and practitioners to apply an ethical lens in your work with volunteers. However, we don't play an enforcement role. So, we want to make sure that you have the information and the tools available to support and encourage ethical decision-making skills, but no one's going to call you and be like, you handled that situation wrong. We're all growing and learning and evolving in our practice. So hopefully by having access to today's training and some of the tools that you'll get, it will help you to encourage ethical decision making. And again, our doors are always open if this is something that you need help with. If you ever have something that happens in your organization where you need a little bit of help, you can always contact CCVA and we'll make sure to put you in touch with someone that can help you through making an ethical decision. So as we go through the material today, I want you to consider the word ethics and how you would define it. Now, for me, it's one of those things, I know what I mean when I use the word ethics, but it can be hard to explain to others. It can feel complicated depending on the context and the situation and how I personally feel about it, and who the other players are that are involved in the situation. So what you're seeing now on the screen are some of the words that are often used when talking about or thinking about ethics. Words like morals, beliefs, values, policies, and culture. Now, some of these words are more associated with individuals or personal practices like morals and beliefs. Others might be more applicable to groups or organizations like values, policies, and culture. Values is one of those ones that can be assigned to individuals, but also we use it in organizational culture as well. Now, all of these terms certainly represent important concepts and rules that we can't ignore when we're working together and when we're working with communities, but they may mean different things to different people, and that can feel confusing and overwhelming, especially when it comes down to how do we practically apply ethics in a real world situation. So I want to start with a really simple idea that I hope that we can all understand. So think of ethics as a backpack that each of us carries with us. For you, it might be a crossbody. For someone else, it might be a briefcase, whatever it is, but think of it as something that you carry with you, okay? So if we're thinking about an ethics backpack, your ethics backpack is part of who you are, and it influences how you behave. It's deeply personal and it's unique. And I want to give you permission when you're thinking about ethics to really bring your whole self into this. Your ethics backpack should be deeply personal and unique because you as an individual are unique. You have your own lived experiences. And that's really important to make sure that you're considering that when you're making, as part of all of the things that are in your ethical backpack. Okay. Now, you and I might have some of the same contents in our backpack, right? So you and I might have some of the same things, but there's going to be other content that's quite different. So I say this to say that even though we all have a unique backpack, we can never assume that somebody else's ethical backpack is the same as our own, which makes sense, right? So when we look a little more closely at what is in our backpacks, there's three types of ethics, right, in our ethical backpack. The first is our personal ethics, which I kind of talked about a little bit on the previous screen. So your personal ethics are just that, okay? They're yours and they're very subjective, right? Your values and your principles are influenced by your history, your experience, maybe your religious beliefs, your ethnicity, your culture, maybe even your birth order, right? These are all the things that influence your personal ethics. And for me, in my ethical backpack, they influence my personal ethics. Then there are your organizational ethics, right? So organizational ethics are usually a set of principles that govern the behavior of a group of people, right? So they can be called our code of ethics. Sometimes we call them our guiding values. And a lot of nonprofits and even businesses have these principles. Often they're posted on our websites. Maybe they're even on your business card. They are front and center and they share with people what you believe in and what is important to you. The purpose of having organizational ethics, a code of conduct, or guiding values, for example, is that you want to ensure consistency of action rather than leaving it up to each individual person to behave according to their own personal ethics. So when we join an organization as an employee or a volunteer, we're agreeing usually to abide by the values and rules of that organization. Your current organization might have a code of ethics or values, and you might ask, volunteers to sign off on these. If you are an employee, you might have to sign off on your organizational ethics and values as well. Okay. You might want to take a look at the ethics we are about to discuss next, which are our professional ethics, to see how much overlap or consistency there is between your organizational ethics and your professional ethics. So, for what we're going to talk about today within that backpack, we're going to be talking about professional ethics. So, professional ethics are values and principles that apply to a specific field of activity. There's some obvious examples in our day-to-day lives where we might see this at play. So, for example, doctors, lawyers, accountants, human resources, or fundraising professionals, they all have a code of ethics or values and principles that they follow as well. And we often, if we are meeting with a new healthcare practitioner, for example, they'll make us aware that they have a code of ethics that they have to follow, and we have to sign off that, we know that you're aware. Sometimes when you go to a doctor's office, there's tons of paperwork that you have to sign off on, or if you're working with a new lawyer, for example, they may say I have my ethics or my values that I have to follow, and that they want you to be aware of that as well. Okay. Professional ethics define a foundation for practice that's universally accepted no matter the setting. So, medical ethics, for example, they apply whether you're working in a hospital, a private practice, or a free clinic. Okay. For us as leaders of volunteers, it's the same thing. Our professional ethics apply whether that is whether we're managing volunteers in a hospital, at a performing arts center, in a food pantry, at a local soccer club, right? Wherever it might be, it's universally accepted no matter what the setting. So this is the type of ethics, our professional ethics and volunteer administration, that we're going to be focusing on today. So with all of this in our backpacks, right, is it any surprise that sometimes there can be a conflict, right? Hopefully, there's a great deal of overlap between our three types of ethics, but sometimes we encounter a situation where one of the values in one part of our backpack may clash with another, and we're faced with difficult decisions at that time. We think about, which ethics do we honor? Do I honor my personal ethics? Do I honor my professional ethics? Do I honor my organizational ethics? Which ones do I honor, and which ones am I okay to set aside or prioritize over another? Okay. This is why ethical dilemmas happen and why they can be hard to navigate. But I'm hoping that by going through the core values today and an ethical decision framework that I can help you to navigate an ethical dilemma when it arrives a little easier. Okay. So now that we understand the three types of ethics in our backpack, let's look a little more closely at the professional ethics and what those contain. So what you're looking at now are the five core values for volunteer engagement professionals: citizenship, respect, accountability, fairness, and trust. They make up the acronym CRAFT. And I love that because what we do is a craft, right? We do have unique skills and competencies that help us to engage and galvanize our communities in working for each other. You might wonder, where did these come from? How did we decide on craft? Well, it's based on a very well-known framework used by many professions. So years ago, the Josephson Institute of Ethics, who are very well known, conducted an extensive international research project, and that led them to the conclusion that all kinds of people everywhere agree on a set of core values, or what Josephson called pillars of character. Now, these universal values became the basis for creating a common set of ethical principles, which we are using when we are searching for the right thing to do. A lot of professions have developed their codes of ethics based on these same core values. And back in the 1970s, AVA used the Josephson work framework for the original work that was done on ethics. And during the 2016 revision process, our task force revisited the pillars of character, and now it's resulted in these five core values that we have for our profession. So over the next few slides, I'm going to provide more details about each of these ethical core values. And there's also a one-page handout that Jennifer will send to you along with these slides. It's also available on our website that you can have. So please don't feel like you have to scribble and write everything down. Everything will be provided for you. All right, so let's start with the first core value, which is citizenship. On each of the five next slides, what I'm going to do is I'm going to define each core value, and then I'm also going to talk about how each core value is informed by three different principles, right? And those principles explain more fully how that value is applied practically in our daily work, okay? So citizenship is, for me, it is an understanding. So when I think about myself as a practitioner and my commitment to the ethical professional values and principles as a practitioner, in leaders, in engaging volunteers, citizenship to me means that I understand that volunteerism is a foundation of civil societies and it guides organizations towards active community participation. So we do that through three principles, and one is a philosophy of volunteerism. So I personally have a very clear philosophy of what volunteerism is to me, and I support the development of my organization in an organizational philosophy of volunteer engagement. And if this is not something you're familiar with, take some time to think about, what do you truly believe about volunteerism? For me, it's really simple. I believe that all people should have access to being part of solutions within their community, to being part of making sure that their communities are healthy or healthier than what they started out to be. And that everyone should be welcome in spaces to volunteer and to be part of those solutions. That's my philosophy of volunteerism. And so the way that I carry that out, or how policies and procedures are developed, or what tools are developed, or how I invite people into that process, is all guided by my personal philosophy of volunteerism. And I encourage organizations that I work with to also develop and have their own. So if that's not something that you personally have, think about what that philosophy of volunteerism is for you. The next principle is around social responsibility, which basically means that we facilitate, as practitioners, we facilitate a compassionate and caring culture where community needs are met and shared values are enhanced because volunteers are involved in those solutions. And then lastly is the principle of philanthropy. So it's our responsibility to cultivate and model what the generosity of spirit and time and resources can do, and how do we use volunteer engagement to meet community needs. So how do we take those resources of spirit and time and put those towards meeting whatever our organization's mission is and whatever the community needs are, okay? So this is the first value of, this is the first value of that acronym of CRAFT. Next is respect, which means that we acknowledge the inherent value and skills and abilities of all individuals, and that we are aware and we affirm that there's a mutual benefit gained by the volunteer and the organization, and the community, right? So when a volunteer is involved, whether they represent the community that they're from or whether they are outside of the community that's being helped by the mission of the organization, there's a mutual benefit that's there. Okay. So we acknowledging that acknowledges the respect that we have for all individuals that are part of those relationships. We demonstrate that through the principles of dignity, meaning that we act in a compassionate manner and we uphold the right of all volunteers to be valued and to be involved in decisions that affect them. This is something that was new for me when I really sat and thought about it. When I got my CVA about 10 years ago, I was in the profession for about 16 years. And when I had to think about ethics and the idea that volunteers need to be involved in decisions that affect them, it really pointed out some gaps for me in my practice, in that oftentimes I was making decisions and changing policies and procedures or creating tools, even building recognition programs and events for volunteers without their input. And when I shifted and thought about the dignity of a volunteer and how involving them could make the experience so much more richer and so much more meaningful for them, it really helped with retention. It helped with volunteer satisfaction. And it really helped me to cultivate a culture where volunteers just felt like they had more of a voice and felt more welcome and felt like they really belonged in the organization because they were involved in decisions that affected them. And that's what we mean by dignity there. Inclusivity is something that's so timely and relevant for today. It talks about, and what we mean by that is that we encourage and we facilitate the participation of individuals from diverse backgrounds, perspectives, and ability. I'm really proud of our field and that I see that there's so much more work that's being done in terms of individuals who like us, right, who lead volunteers, who are trying to make sure that the invitation to volunteer is broader, right? How can I include more people in the invitation? How can I make sure more people see themselves in the invitation to volunteer? And that's another way to demonstrate the value of respect. And then lastly is privacy, right? Protecting the privacy of volunteers and information that's considered confidential. And this is not just, we protect their email addresses and their phone numbers, this and their birth dates, right? This goes beyond that. This goes beyond contact information and what we might collect on a form. This is also about the stories and experiences that volunteers share with us. So I'm in my 26th year of managing volunteers, and it is such a privilege when a volunteer shares personal information with you. I have had volunteers share with me, I had a volunteer share with me that they were going to propose to their partner over the weekend. They showed me the ring and asked my opinion, and they were so excited. I've had people share with me a cancer diagnosis, right? And cry on my shoulder and need a hug and ask for advice on how to break the news to their family or just ask for some support and ask me to follow up with them next week to see how they're doing. So there are things that volunteers share with us, and for some of us, due to the nature of the work that we do, sometimes these are tough things, sometimes these are joyful things, but all of these are things that these are things where we need to remember that we also have to protect the privacy of our volunteers and the things that they tell us that is confidential. And that also means, not sharing these things with staff in terms of, things for gossip or fodder. Okay. So thinking about respect in how we treat the information volunteers share with us. All right. Let's talk about the next value, which is accountability. We, as leaders of volunteers, demonstrate responsibility to our organizations, our stakeholders, and by that I mean the community that we engage with to do our work, but also the community that we support. And also each other, the profession of volunteer administration. So we have accountability in so many different areas, to our employers, to the community we support, to each other, to the community we engage. And we do that through collaboration. So we make sure to include all of our stakeholders in the development and the support of volunteer engagement. We cultivate partnerships to enhance the impact of volunteers. So wherever we see synergies and ways that we can work together, That is one of the ways we hold each other accountable and have transparency in our work. We do that through continuous improvement, like today, right? Pursuing excellence in your craft, enhancing your professional competence by attending webinars through Idealist, maintaining certifications like the CVA through CCVA, or fostering innovation in any of the ways that you do it, whether it's a new volunteer management system, trying out a new recognition program, surveying your volunteers, whatever it is that signals that there's always room for improvement. That's another way to demonstrate the accountability. And then lastly is professionalism, right? Wanting to and striving to provide outstanding service to your organization and the people and land that it serves while upholding personal and professional boundaries in all of your interactions. So that's what we mean by accountability. So moving on to the value of fairness, so timely for today. This is one of the values that pops up a lot when we think about ethical decisions and how to make an ethical decision and thinking about the framework. What we mean here is that, as a leader of volunteers, we commit to individual, so our own and collective efforts that build and support a fair and just organizational culture. So we do this through impartiality, remaining unbiased and objective when we work with any of our stakeholders, through the principle of equity, so ensuring access to opportunities, resources, and support that will enable volunteers to be successful. And then lastly, justice, implementing open and consistent processes that inform our decision-making and address discriminatory or prejudicial behaviors, right? Really timely for a lot of conversations that are happening today, and a little bit in Erin's case study as well, which we'll revisit in a little bit. And then lastly is the value of trust. As a leader of volunteers, we always want to maintain loyal and trusting relationships. We want to make sure that we are providing a safe environment based on established standards of practice. And if you're not familiar with standards of practice in the volunteer engagement field, I encourage you to look to our friends at Alive, the Association of Leaders in Volunteer Engagement. Their website is volunteeralive.org. They have established standards of practice that are there. Take a look and see how your organization and your volunteer practices measure up. If you're in Canada, PAVRO, the Professional Association of Leaders of Volunteers in Ontario, also has standards of practice, very similar to Alive, just sort of in a different format that you can take a look at as well. When we think about this value of trust, the principles that highlighted are honesty, so simple. As leaders of volunteers, we commit to the truth and we strive for transparency, right? We're not trying to hide anything that we do. We're able to be transparent about our work. Integrity, a consistency between words and actions, by practicing ethical decision-making, and then addressing conflicts of interest where they might be. And then lastly, a commitment to act in a forthright manner with good intent, and to follow through on the promises and agreements that we make, right? Our word is not good, and we can't build trust if we are not following through on the promises and agreements that we make. So this has been a super quick introduction to the values and principles for our profession, but I'm sure a lot of these words were familiar to you, not surprising to you, and this language is what you would see in many codes of ethics, which is a good thing, right? Here it's been tailored to the context in which we do our work, and I strongly encourage you to create some future opportunities to walk through these with your peers, talk a little bit more about how each one relates to our specific context as leaders of volunteers. So before we move on, I want to just highlight something really important. I'm going to move into a process for making ethical decisions, but before we do that, I want to remind you that not all difficult or sticky situations involve ethics, okay? Ethical dilemmas have some very specific characteristics. So there's some questions here on the screen. Is this situation very unusual? Is there a conflict between values or beliefs? Are multiple stakeholders involved? I have a policy that says do this, but I'm not sure that's right. Is there a downside to making the correct choice? If you're answering yes to some or all of these questions, you probably have an ethical dilemma. What's specific about ethical dilemmas is that they are rooted in a very specific context or situation. So if you have a situation that keeps coming up over and over and over again, it's probably not an ethical dilemma. There's probably an opportunity for you there to make sure people are understanding policies or procedures. Maybe there's a gap in your policies and procedures, or maybe there is an opportunity for additional training or training refresher if a situation keeps coming up, right? Um, does the conflict involve um, uh, two or more values or principles, right? So for it to be an ethical dilemma, there's got to be a conflict between more than two ethical values or principles from craft that we just went over. And I'll illustrate this when we look at Erin's example as well. For it to be an ethical dilemma, it also needs to involve the claims of multiple stakeholders. So this is not just you toying with something, a situation on your own, right? There are multiple stakeholders involved in this situation, and that is another thing that makes it characteristic of an ethical dilemma. And then lastly, perhaps there's a policy that would usually be followed in this situation, but for some reason, in this specific context, the policy doesn't seem right. It's not fitting. It does not consider a specific experience or a viewpoint. And sometimes this is when we know policies need to be updated, right? A policy is written, but technology has changed, times have changed, language has changed, or what we know about people has changed, and the policy does not fit. And so there's like a yes or a but, those kinds of things that are popping up into our brain. Okay. So not every difficult road that we go down as leaders of volunteers necessarily means it's an ethical dilemma. So when we go through this ethical decision-making process, it's really helpful for making ethical decisions, and it's specific to those as well. And I'm not saying that it can't be used in other situations as well, but it has been developed for ethical dilemmas. All right, so let's get through the ethical decision-making process. It is quite simple, and it involves 5 steps. And when you're confronted with what feels like an ethical dilemma, we do recommend you following these 5 steps. Now, before I go through them, what I want to say is that this process is not unique to leaders of volunteers. You'll find a similar process explained in a lot of other professions as well, especially those who go through and who work with ethical decision-making processes as well. And that's because it works. It's simple and it works, and it's effective for a few different reasons. One is when you go through this process, it promotes a fuller understanding of the situation, right? So it's not just you deciding on a gut reaction what you should do next, right? There is a process that you follow that helps you to promote a fuller understanding of the situation. And many of you alluded to that when I asked you, what should Erin do? You knew that more information was needed, right? Second is that it avoids that knee-jerk reaction based on personal ethics. It forces you to pause and take time before you take action. It encourages creative thinking and multiple perspectives about possible solutions. So it encourages you to think about all the different options that are out there. And then it provides a safe way for you to explore different options without causing harm to anyone and before you make a final decision. So there's a test that you can go through to do some exploration. And then finally, when you follow these steps and you have a decision that you've made, you end up with a defensible decision, right? So if somebody asks you, how did you come to this decision? You have a way in which you can define that and you can say that because you've gone through these steps as well. Stephanie, thanks for your comment in the chat. I believe this is going to be recorded, and so you can pick up where you left off if you have to jump off. All right, so when you're confronted with challenging ethical dilemmas, it's really natural to want to find the absolute right answer, okay? You want to make sure that everyone is happy. You want to have the absolute right answer. You don't want to make a mistake. Now, the reality is every situation is unique. And the course of action that we take is going to have some negative consequences that are unavoidable for one of the stakeholders, right? And it could be you. You might be the person that has to put something aside in order to make a decision, right? What these ethical dilemmas do is provide us with a lot of valuable learning opportunities. And our goal in coming to a decision is to make a decision based on the best information we can get at the time, to be clear about why we're making the decision, and to be prepared for any potential negative implications. So we've thought through all of those things before we make a decision. And perfection's not usually an option in these cases. And I'll get to why. And when I say perfection is not an option, it doesn't mean the decision that you come to is going to be awful. It just means it may not be perfect. It just may mean that one person might be disappointed, one person might be angry, right? Or one person may be happier than another. So let's talk a little bit more about what that means. Okay. So when we go through the decision-making process, the first step is gathering information. When we're at the gathering information stage, first thing we want to do is identify the facts, right? We want evidence and not just hearsay and not just people's feelings. Those are important, but we also want facts, right? So we want to understand evidence again, not just hearsay. We want situational context, what's unique about this situation. We want multiple perspectives. So we want to know who's involved. Are there any perspectives that I'm not hearing, right? Where the other people involved or present? Who are all the people that can provide us with information on what we're seeing? Okay. The other thing we're finding about when we are going through the gathering information stage is we want to find out what our policies are and if any of our policies are relevant to this situation. And if so, can they be applied, or are they not sort of fitting in this specific situation? We want to be able to name that and to be able to talk about that as well. I see a question in the chat about, are you going to receive the slides after the presentation? Yes, you'll receive the slides after the presentation and the recording as well. Next, you want to identify the dilemma, okay? So the thing that you want to ask is, which two or more values or principles are at the heart of the dilemma? What's the main tension that's happening there, right? So what's the rub, right? What's the tension? This is where you might want to consult your organizational's ethics or values as well as this material here from CCVA. You want to find out where there are congruencies and overlap. And, is there a spot where something is missing on either end? Naming this dilemma, naming what the main tension is really important, because that is what's going to take you down the next path in terms of reaching what the decision is, okay? So when you've named and identified the dilemma, so you've got all your information that you need, as much as you can get with the time that you have in the moment, then you've named what the dilemma is. Next, you're going to explore the options and consequences. So what are the different options and what are the consequences of those options? What are the different steps that I can take, right? You're going to imagine all the possible pros and cons of each action you can take. You're going to think about whether there are any legal implications, are there policy implications? What happens if I go down, if I open door number 1 and I go down that road, what happens there? If I go down door number 2, what happens if I do that, right? You're going to follow the various paths safely, in theory, in your mind. Before acting, you're going to think about what are the possible implications that could happen, so that you've thought of those ahead of making your decision, okay? Then what you're going to do is test some of those. You're going to make a decision around which one of those do I want to test. You're going to take it through what we call the click test, and you're going to seek the path of least harm, okay? Let me show you what the click test is before we go to the last step number 5. So this is the click test. I love the click test, but this is one of the tests that you can use to apply to evaluate a decision or a course of action that you plan to make. This one is really useful because it goes through the acronym CLICK. So the first thing you're thinking about is consequence, right? If I'm going to go through door number 1 and that's my choice, what are the consequences of doing that? Who's going to benefit if I take that decision, and who's going to suffer? And you want to think about that. You want to do the same thing for door number 2 if you're trying to decide between the both of them, right? What are the consequences of each? Then you're going to think about the L in click, which is legal. Are there legal consequences if I do this, or if my organization takes this stand? Are we okay with that, right? Or are we not, right? Or are there none at all, right? Making that consideration is really important as well. You're going to think about image next. And when you're thinking about image, questions you might ask yourself are things like, would I be comfortable seeing this decision on the nightly news, right? Or someone made a TikTok about it, or it's on Facebook or Instagram and somebody's talking about it. Would I be comfortable with that? Will that decision hurt or harm our public image? We obviously can't control what people say, or the messaging that gets out there, but how would we feel about what this making this decision might mean to our image? And it may mean nothing, but it may have implications, and so we need to consider that. Next, we want to think about culture, and we want to think about the culture within our organization. Does this decision support the culture we're trying to create or the culture that we have, or does it harm it? And we want to think about that as well. And then lastly, we do want to bring our personal bias and our personal ethics into this a little bit. And so I love that we have a little bit of space to consider this. We think about the K in click, which is K stands for not. And not for me, for some of you, not may not make sense, but for me, it makes sense in that, like, sometimes you get this gut reaction and people say I have a knot in my stomach. Other people might say I break out into a sweat or my face turns really bright. Whatever that knot represents for you, basically what you're doing in the click test is you're just doing a gut check, right? Does this action cause a knot in my stomach? On a gut level, emotionally, how do I feel about this? Would my mentors approve of me doing this, right? What would my kids say if I made this decision? What would my parents or loved ones say about me making this decision, right? And there's a little bit of room in using the click test to bring our personal feelings into it and help to inform how we're feeling, or just give ourselves a little bit of grace in thinking about that as well. So the final act in our decision-making process is to act. We act with confidence, with courage, and with professionalism. Again, I want to say there's no perfect answer, right? There won't be a 100% guarantee that you've made the best decision, but you will be able to justify your actions because you followed a rational, a thoughtful process. You took into account all the contents of your ethical backpack. You took things through the click test. You took the time really to get information, to name the dilemma, to explore what the different steps could be, to really think about what the negative implications would be before you made a decision, okay? And that really helps to make your decision a bit stronger. So to help you work through these decision-making steps, we developed a simple worksheet, a decision-making worksheet that we'll send to you after today's webinar. And it's also available on our website. And this sort of helps you to go through that fourth step where you're testing what your decisions might be, right? You would, on this sheet, you would think about who are all the stakeholders involved in the situation at hand. What are the core values that are in conflict for you? And then you have a chart where you can think about what are your possible responses, what's the possible decision you can make, what are the positive consequences to each of the stakeholders, and then what are some of the negative ones. And so it just helps you to map that out for yourself. If you're a person that having a tool or writing it down or having a framework is helpful, this tool is here for you. People often ask me, what do I do with this once I filled it out? I always say to keep a copy for yourself, right? So that, ethical dilemmas are not things we should be facing every day, but keep a copy for yourself so that you have it in the future if you have to revisit a situation. And if your organization has a records keeping policy and there's somewhere else that you would need to keep this, whether in a confidential file or in a volunteer's file or an employee file, keep a copy of it there as well. So that worksheet is also available for you to use when you're making a decision. Okay, let's go back to Erin. And as a reminder, for those of you who joined a little bit later, Erin is the community engagement manager at a food pantry. One of their board members has heard rumors that a volunteer had an encounter with the law and had to appear in court. Erin is already aware of the situation. It's not a barrier for the volunteer to do their role. The board member asks Erin to confirm this information and says the volunteer must be dismissed if it's true. What do you think Erin should do? So, let's go through the decision-making steps, okay? So if you were Erin and this was the point where you're just trying to gather information, what do you want to know, right? So knowing what you know as Erin and from what the board member told you, what are the different things that you would want to know as Erin before moving forward in making this decision? So you can use Menti to throw out the different questions or things that you're worried or confused or concerned about or thinking about. Use menti.com and you can use the code 4887 4901. And yeah, let's see together, what are the things that we would be curious about at the gathering information stage. So this board member has come to you. They've said, I heard this volunteer, um, you know, had an interaction with the law. They had to appear in court. What does Aaron need to know in terms of dealing with the situation, right? So some really good questions popping up so far. Some questions around policies. Does the food bank have a policy that would require the dismissal of the volunteer? What are the policies? Is there a policy in place? There's also some questions around does the board member actually know about the policy, right? And then there's some questions around, well, how did the board member find this out, right? I would be curious about that as well. How did the board member find this out? Where did they get this information from? There's a really interesting question here as well. How does the incident impact the people around the volunteer, right? Is it even relevant, right? What somebody wrote, was the incident? Does it affect the volunteer's ability to do their role? So these are all great questions, right? So does the interaction with the law impact their volunteer role? Does the board member have a pre-existing relationship with the volunteer? Is there a safety issue? What's the severity of the activity? What exactly does the board member know? Was the legal interaction for a violent crime? So this is great. Why? There's also a question in here as well around, oh, sorry. Why? Sorry, every time I touch my screen to move up here, it's moving to the next slide. Give me a second here, and sorry for that visual shock there going back between members. But somebody says, why did the volunteers start at the food bank? Did they need to complete community service hours for the legal issue? I mean, that is a great, I've done this case study so many times and no one's ever brought that up, but what a great thing to point out, right? Maybe this volunteer is doing community service hours, right? And that's maybe none of the board members' business, for example, okay? But also taking into account other things, right? Did the incident happen while they were volunteering? Is the volunteer in good standing? What's the background of the volunteer? Are they new? Have they been here for a while? So this is wonderful. At the gathering information stage, these are all the different things that would be useful to know. So I put together a few different things. So step one would be and these are things that you have all alluded to as well, but what are the organization's policies combining background checks and privacy? What's the board member's role and reach in this situation? Like, do they have a say around volunteer dismissals? What information did the board member hear and how? Have they discussed it with anybody else? And one of the things as well in the gathering information stage is to really identify who are all the stakeholders in this situation. So for me, it's the organization, the board member, who the board member reports to, which is often different. Usually board members report to the CEO, not necessarily the volunteer coordinator, or in Aaron's case, the community engagement manager, the volunteer, other volunteers, clients at the food pantry, the community that they're in, and then Aaron. These are all sort of the different people to consider and think about as Aaron goes through and making their decision, okay? So next, Aaron needs to identify the conflict. And thinking through this, personally, I think, and you might identify it differently, and that's fine. As long as you identify a conflict, which then helps you to move forward in exploring what the possible options are. For Aaron, for the sake of just kind of moving forward, I'll identify that the main conflict for Aaron is that the board member is asking them about confidential information and is trying to direct Aaron to dismiss the volunteer. So for Aaron, that's what Aaron is identifying as the conflict. The board member, right? Bringing something confidential to them and then also trying to tell them what to do, right? So for Aaron, if that is the conflict that's identified, here are, I think, 6 different possible actions and outcomes that Aaron thinks about. Okay, what are the possible ways I could handle this? I could let the CEO know what has happened so that they can talk to the board member about what their board responsibilities are, right? So Aaron could sort of say, I don't have jurisdiction over this board member. I'm going to let the CEO know and let them have that conversation. Aaron could listen to the board member and let them know that they'll look into it and maybe it doesn't come up again. Aaron could listen to the CEO and let them know that they'll look into the situation, and the board member could follow up, right, and demand, I want to know what happened, right? Aaron could listen to the board member and reiterate that the volunteer is entitled to their privacy. Aaron could remind the board member of the food pantry's screening processes and policies without compromising the volunteer's privacy. Aaron could also let the volunteer know about the rumor. And for those of you who are on this call, you may also be thinking about other possible actions and outcomes. So you'll see that when you take the time to stop and sort of think about what all of them are, it can help you to get clearer about the situation and to think about all the different perspectives that are involved. Okay, so in this, potential situation, Aaron could then take any of those six possible actions and outcomes, and maybe there's seven or eight or nine or 10 of them, and then they are going to take it through the click test, right? They're going to take each of these through the click test and think about which one is going to lead them down the path of least resistance and least harm. And then they're going to make that decision and act with confidence, courage, and professionalism. Now, for the case of Aaron, this was a hypothetical situation. Some of our case studies are real case studies where I can tell you what the outcome of the situation is. In this one, it doesn't really matter, right? What the outcome is. It's really more about understanding the process and how you get to the outcome. Now, for you and your organization, you may never interact with board members, right? You may be someone that interacts with board members all the time. In your situation, if this was something that you were presented with, it may be appropriate for you to direct this to the CEO and ask them to handle it. While maintaining the volunteers' confidentiality. You may be in a really small grassroots organization where everybody kind of knows everybody, and it might be something where it has to be handled a little bit more delicately in order to protect the volunteers' privacy and also to make the board member feel heard and that you've listened to them, but also to be firm with them around confidentiality as well. Each of us is going to think about the situation differently depending on the context that we're in, and each of us is right. And really, what the ethical decision-making process does is help you to gather all that information, identify the dilemma, think of all the possible consequences, use the click test to decide which is the best option for you, and then act on it with confidence, courage, and professionalism. And knowing that if you have to defend your situation, you have a process with which you can follow. One thing that I want to share with you, sort of on a personal note, is whenever I have followed this decision-making process, I've never had to defend it, because when it's come time to actually make a decision, in making your decision, you can always talk about how you arrived at that decision, and then you don't need to defend it later on. What's also happened to me in the past is I'll make a decision, I will talk about how I arrived to that decision, and somebody with more seniority or somebody with a little more power in the situation might do something a little bit different, or handle it in a little bit of a different way, and that's okay too. I think as long as you have maintained the ethical standards, you've gone through the decision making, and you've presented a situation as best as you can, I think you are living your professional values as best as you can in that situation. So, one of the things that I encourage you to also think about when it comes to making ethical decisions is this idea of moral courage. I love this quote by Rushworth Kidder at the Institute for Global Ethics, which says, "Moral courage is the quality of mind and spirit that enables one to face up to ethical dilemmas and moral wrongdoings firmly and confidently without flinching or retreating." I will admit that early on in my career, whenever I had a dilemma, whether it was an ethical one or not, I used to do this default of like running to my supervisor, especially when I was really young and just out of university and not sure and wanted to people please and didn't want to upset volunteers and really centered volunteers over anybody else. I would go to my supervisor and be like, "I don't know how to handle this. Can you take care of it?" And what I realize is that I was not building my moral courage. And even to this day, there's room to keep building on our moral courage. But basically, when we take on the responsibility of leading volunteers, and what a privilege and responsibility it is, and what power and privilege and access we have when somebody is giving us or the resource of their time, which they can never get back. That is a great power and privilege that we have in doing that work. And I think that we owe it to our community. We owe it to the volunteers that choose to volunteer with us to walk with this posture of moral courage, right? And to face up to these dilemmas and any moral wrongdoings firmly and confidently without feeling the need to flinch or retreat like I used to do and pass it on to somebody else. And that's why we do this work around our ethics, and we do this work around thinking about these case studies and moving forward with them. So it's something for us to think about as we navigate these dilemmas in our daily work, all because we want to make our communities a better place. So there are different ways to sustain our moral courage, right? We have to keep talking about ethics. And when it comes down to it, we've got to think about ethical decisions, kind of like maybe how you might think about physical exercise, right? Or any good habit that you're trying to create, right? The more we do it, the stronger we become or the better we become at it. And a regular attention to ethics really will create that strength that makes ethical behavior and moral courage habitual. So there's a few ideas that I have for you on how to do that. You'll get a handout which is called the CCVA Values and Principles. It's got craft and everything that I just talked about to have. Post it near your desk or just make time to revisit it every once in a while. Talk about ethics at staff or volunteer orientations or even information sessions that you have for potential volunteers. You might even want to talk about the process, if you have one, for reporting or handling unethical behavior at your organization. Some larger organizations do have those processes in place. I know in some healthcare organizations, there are ethics officers. Some of our smaller organizations may have other ways in which you report behavior like that. If not, just talking about it and saying that this is something that is important signals to volunteers or potential volunteers that you care about their experience and that you have a code of ethics. You take your work seriously as well, okay? You can use case studies as discussion starters in staff meetings or volunteer meetings. We have lots of them at CCVA and are happy to share them with you. You can practice a decision-making process using those case studies as well. One of the best things that I think you can do is develop what I call your sounding board. Other colleagues in our profession, maybe you met people through an Idealist webinar or through your local AVA or Dovia or Volunteer Center or Volunteer Hub, and look to people to be part of your sounding board. For me, that has been one of the most powerful tools in practicing ethical decision making, being able to call someone up and say like, hey, this is what's happening. Here's how I'm feeling. Are you seeing anything different? What am I missing? What questions should I be asking? And having trusted individuals who understand the context of our work and what we do, that you could just call, right? Or text or be in touch with. And I raise my hand. If you're ever looking for someone, I love talking about these things. I learned so much from being someone else's sounding board. And so if you ever are looking for someone, find me on LinkedIn. I'm happy to help you work through some of these decisions. Now, if you're like me and you like geeking out about ethics, there are also a lot of other resources that you can look into for further research. Over at the CCVA website, we have an ethics portion on our website with some more resources there. You can also email us if there are case studies that you want to look at or go over by yourself or with a team. Independent sector in the United States, in their resources section, if you search ethics and accountability, they've got some great resources. The Josephson Institute of Ethics that we really relied heavily upon and many professions rely heavily upon has a lot of resources as well when it comes to ethics. And there's a really cool tool you can Google by Carter McNamara. It's a booklet. It's called Complete Guide to Get Ethics Management and Ethics Toolkit for Managers. It's not specific to volunteer engagement, but it's really great for people who manage other people and thinking about ethics in that role. So those are some resources that are there for you as well. So we have a little bit of time, and I want to just take some time now to invite you to come off mute and share your camera if you would like. There's quite a few of us that are here. If any of you have a situation that you're currently thinking about or have a past situation that you would like to share, feel free. This is a space where if you're comfortable, we're happy to do that with you now. Jennifer and I are both here for a little bit longer and happy to do that with you and talk through some things with you. It might also be beneficial for others to hear and learn from your situation. Otherwise, thank you so much for being here. Jennifer will have the recording up on the Learning Center tomorrow, and we'll also email you the slides and the handouts. So appreciative of you being here today. Jennifer and I are still here. If there's any comments or questions or a situation that you want to talk about, we have time for that. And thanks for all of your kudos and info in the chat there. We're happy that you were able to come, and thank you for all your thank yous.
Thank you, Faiza. This was really always so good to work through and to think about. And I really appreciate the sort of format of thinking about like what other information do you need? What information do you have? What makes sense for you in this role in your organization? Because so often in these ethical dilemmas, we really do have to take context and relationships and situations into consideration as we move forward.
Yeah. And then Jennifer, can we stop the recording just in
Oh, sure.
case anyone wants to share but is feeling uncomfortable about it being recorded? So if you do want to
Absolutely.
share something,